Hello, fantasy football fans. This is Scott Spratt, joined by Michael Moore. Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Slant, powered by ProFootballFocus.com. I had a nice week off last week, Michael, and so I really enjoyed listening to both you and Joey Cardilano, who is one of our major rookie experts at Pro Football Focus Fantasy. You guys had a really interesting show last week talking about some of the rookies and what their sort of tiering situation would be when you're doing rookie drafts. So that was a really great time. So today, though, we're going to actually jump forward a little bit. We've done our own rookie analysis previously as well. We're going to talk about some second-year wide receivers and focus. Well, we're really going to hit pretty much everyone that we think is fantasy relevant, and I think it's going to probably take us 2 shows to get through all of that. But today we're going to start with 6 of the really major guys, ranging from guys that are already established down to some guys who I think may be viable sleepers for this season. But before we cover that, Michael, I think there was one interesting bit of news that just came down as far as I could tell. It must have happened today. But Giants running back David Wilson was actually cleared to once again participate with team activities and cleared to actually make contact. So that he had a very scary neck injury last season, Michael. And I guess people were worried that that might have been a career-ending injury. He never really got his career started on the right foot in the first place after being a first-round pick 2 years ago. But he's got a lot of talent. He's one of the faster players in the NFL, Michael. Now that he's cleared, A, does this come as a sort of a surprise, or does this match your expectations in terms of timeline? And B, how do you handicap the Giants running back situation for this season?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's very good news, obviously. Anytime you're dealing with any injury in football, but especially a neck injury, it's always a little dicey. So I think it's great news that he's back. I think as far as fantasy-wise, I think he's probably a good late-round pick, in your redrafts. But I don't know that anyone should be banking on him necessarily to contribute, anything. I mean, they did sign Rashad Jennings to sort of be that 3-down back, and by all indications, they're not changing or they're not deviating from that plan. So, all indications are they're going to ease him back into it. I mean, yes, he was cleared, but that doesn't necessarily mean, hey, we're gonna give him the ball 20 times a game right off the bat. So, I think you still have to treat him with kid gloves, fantasy-wise. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I said, is he a late-round guy that you could stash, and especially in deeper rosters, is he worth it? I think so, but I don't see him as necessarily a starter anytime soon.
See, that's interesting because in a redraft league, I'm more likely to draft Wilson as a late-round sleeper in a shallow league because I feel like that's really the league where he can make an impact because his upside is great, former first-round pick with a lot of talent, but obviously a complicated situation there in New York that I'm finding harder and harder to handicap. In a deeper league, if you're actually going to have to be counting on the guy, then I'm a little bit more nervous. Many people think Rashad Jennings is a very strong, I don't even know if sleeper is the right word, but a guy that's going around maybe Toby Gerhart, Ben Tate range in the mid-20s among running backs. And he could be a potential hindrance to that value there. Does this dampen your Rashad Jennings love at all?
Not really. I think the best case scenario for New York is, hey, they have a Rashad Jennings to be that 3-down guy, and if anything, bring Wilson in to be a super change of pace guy. Like you said, they did draft him in the first round a couple years ago, I think with an eye towards him being the featured back, but he didn't exactly take the reins on that job when he was given the opportunity either. So, I think New York is probably looking for a super sub change of pace type guy. Because look, they committed some years and some money to Rashad Jennings, and not a whole lot, but look, they went out in free agency and got him to fill that need. So to me, it doesn't dampen my feeling on Jennings. Certainly, I have him ranked ahead of the likes of Ben Tate and probably even Toby Gerhart at this point.
Okay, really quickly, and then we need to really move on so we can hit our actual topic. But would you rather have the Giants rookie Andre Williams, or would you rather have David Wilson in dynasty formats?
Ooh. You always pick the tough questions, Scott. Personally, I'd probably go Wilson. He has a little, obviously a little bit of a track record, and I think they both have that sort of explosive ability as their absolute ceiling. So, and the reports with Williams is he's a little more raw, I think, than people thought he was going to be, and he's going to need a little more coaching than some of the other rookies that are coming in, certainly. So, to me, it'd probably be Wilson. What about you?
I also have Wilson higher. To me, it's really a safety versus upside question because I mean, the hallmark of Williams in college was that he was unbelievably healthy and just was able to withstand a huge load of work at BC. So I feel like coming into this season, he's the Giants' back that you feel probably best about from a health standpoint. But again, Wilson is the guy that can take the ball and take it for touchdowns from anywhere on the field. So I feel like if you're looking for a top 10 back in the future, the only man on the team that could really be that is Wilson. And so I think I would probably lean toward him, especially in shallower formats. But I pretty much like all the Giants. I think they all potentially could be very valuable this year. You're just sort of gambling on who you think is the guy.
Well, and you're gambling on Eli Manning, Scott. Let's not forget that. That offense revolves around Eli Manning. If he can't make it go, then I don't know what they're going to do.
I guess they're going to run the ball then, Michael.
True.
All right, so I teased at the top of the show that we're going to talk about some second-year players, specifically wide receivers. And I didn't really organize this in any way except in some crazy way that my mind works. So we're not talking in order of fantasy value necessarily. We're not talking in order of draft picks in the 2013 draft. It's just going to we're going to jump around a little bit, Michael, I guess. But we are going to start with the two guys that I think established themselves most clearly as really fantasy options last season with their play. And really, Michael, these are probably the guys to spend the least amount of time on because I think it's pretty clear that they're going to be early picks in most drafts. Those players are Keenan Allen and Cordarrelle Patterson. Let's start with Allen. Last season, Allen was a round 3 pick by the Chargers. I think all accounts are that he probably would have gone higher in the NFL draft if it hadn't been for a PCL injury that made it very difficult for him to work out, and he was sort of coming into the season as an injured player. However, he sort of established himself as a really great player very early on when some other Chargers receivers got hurt quickly, like Malcolm Floyd, who we'll come back to. And Allen ended up being a very productive player. He was the 18th ranked receiver in fantasy last year in PPR formats, despite really not playing the first 2 weeks. 71 catches, 1,053 yards, and 8 touchdowns. So, I mean, we very rarely see a rookie receiver with those kind of numbers, Michael. And sort of for this exercise, I want to talk about it from both a redraft and dynasty perspective. So let's start from a redraft perspective. He's going off as the 11th wide receiver and 25th overall player in my fantasy league ADP right now. Do you think that he deserves to be considered as the 11th player, the 11th receiver?
You know, when we went over this list offline, I started out really high on Allen, and then just in the span of a couple minutes, I sort of soured on him a little bit. Look, there's no doubt he had an awesome rookie year. Really, the entire Chargers offense last year did really well. I mean, they brought in Ken Wisenhunt as offensive coordinator, and I think they really did a lot of things that they hadn't done before. And Allen was, quite honestly, one of the main beneficiaries of that. You know, as far as his ADP this year, that's probably about right because look, you're still getting the top wide receiver on a pretty good offensive team in Allen. So, you know, if he's a low end wide receiver one in redraft leagues, I could probably live with that. And I think, like you said, I think it was 25th overall was the ADP for him too.
25th, yes.
Yeah, and that would probably put him, you know, in most leagues about the first pick of the 3rd round. So, you know, I could probably live with that. I'm probably, surprisingly, a little more down on him in dynasty formats than redraft leagues, personally.
Interesting. We'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to mention that I feel like Allen is a little bit of a victim of circumstance because there's sort of a clear top tier of receivers that includes guys like Calvin Johnson and Des Bryant, et cetera, that sort of runs out towards the of maybe 8 or so guys. And at that point, it can be really difficult to evaluate whether someone like Allen is a clear step above someone like a Larry Fitzgerald, maybe even a Victor Cruz, who may be going way later in drafts. And so it's sort of a team-building strategy that I feel like makes it difficult to draft Allen. If people are going to prefer Allen over those other comparable players in a one-year situation, then I think he becomes a hard player to draft, although I don't really have a particular problem with his ranking here. Do you see any threat in Malcolm Floyd? Again, Floyd was supposed to be the starter last season, had a neck injury that put him on injured reserve after week 2. He's back. Do you think that that's really any threat to Allen's targets this season?
No, I don't think Floyd is going to be the biggest obstacle for Allen this year. Honestly, I think it's going to be, you know, they're sort of switching out the offense a little bit and going a little more run-based from all indications. And, they brought in Donald Brown to add to that running back by committee they got going on. So, if anything, I think it's going to be a combination of maybe the switch in scheme that's going to cost them, along with, look, what happens when you bust out and you are very productive? The defenses start focusing on you, and I think Allen is going to see a lot more of that this year, which I think between those two things are going to be more of a hindrance on his production than anything Malcolm Floyd could probably do.
Yeah, it's a very strong point, Michael. But remember, too, Ladarius Green is another player that has a lot of people excited this season. So it's possible that there will actually be really multiple skill position players that become difficult to cover for opponents. It's not inconceivable that the Chargers become a very powerful offense this season. So it's something interesting to keep in mind. But let's circle back to his dynasty value. For this exercise, I've included both my own dynasty ranking and the consensus at PFF Fantasy's dynasty ranking, just so we can make that comparison. Keep in mind that I tend to be a guy that favors veteran production, so you may sort of see that trend throughout this. But I ranked Allen as the 11th receiver in Dynasty. The consensus has him 8th. You said you were down on Allen, so are you down on him further than, say, the 11th receiver in Dynasty?
To be honest, I don't have the complete rankings in front of me, but I think I would probably be concerned on my dynasty team if Allen was my first receiver, quite honestly. I think, and I, like you, Scott, are very conservative. I look more at a guy's floor than his ceiling. I mean, I'll readily admit that. So for me, Allen is more of a super wide receiver 2 on a dynasty team than maybe my wide receiver 1. I certainly think 8th is probably too high for him. 11th, I think, is getting in the ballpark, but, to me, I would love it if he were more my, second receiver than my first, probably.
Okay, that's fair. And really, it's a guy that, despite us being maybe a little bit lower on, and really I don't even think of myself as being lower, but he's a guy that clearly is a wide receiver 2 at worst right now in both redraft and dynasty leagues. So I think it's fair to move on from him and talk about some guys that are a little bit more up in the air from a fantasy perspective. So next on the list is Cordarrelle Patterson, who was a round 1 pick by the Vikings last season. I think many thought that he was the most talented receiver in the draft, but somebody that might not be able to contribute right away. And maybe that was true to a certain extent, but Patterson, by the last 6 weeks of the season, was making quite an impact. He was a very effective player overall, too. It didn't have a ton of opportunities earlier in the season. 0.49 points per opportunity last year, though, was 11th best at the position in the league. Overall, for the season, he had 44 catches for 469 yards and 4 touchdowns, as well as 12 rushes for 158 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground, making him the 44th ranked wide receiver in PPR formats. So, I mean, Patterson really adds a dimension that most receivers don't have, and that's really the rushing ability that kind of he inherited sort of that role from Percy Harvin in the Vikings offense. He's jumped up a lot. He's now the 13th ranked receiver in ADP and overall 33rd player in my fantasy league ADP. So, I mean, that's sort of a jump. I mean, he was worthy of that over the last, say, 4 to 6 weeks of the season last season. But I'm a little bit surprised that he's jumped up that quickly as a guy that hasn't even had a full season worth of production yet to sort of back up the belief. What do you think, Michael?
For me, he's an outlier for my for my conservative approach. I really like the guy. I'm one of those Cordarrelle Patterson homers. Yeah, like you said, I mean, when he had the ball, which given wasn't a lot, he made a lot of things happen. And I think there was definitely some question at the beginning of the season that maybe he was a little too raw to contribute right away. But by the end of the season, I mean, they couldn't keep him off the field. And quite honestly, I think a lot of that, a lot of the lack of production, I guess, was probably due to the offensive scheme they had last year, and specifically an offensive coordinator, Bill Musgrave, who I think it was last year, who didn't really utilize Patterson, I think, as much as they should have, and at least obviously now that they know they should have. For me, it all comes down to Norv Turner and what he does with offenses. I'm a Norv Turner apologist as far as a offensive coordinator goes. I think he's fantastic, and I think anything he touches probably turns to gold at any given point. So, for me, and quite honestly, with Minnesota, I mean, they've got Greg Jennings as sort of that veteran receiver there, but I mean, let's be honest, Greg Jennings is getting up there in age and has probably lost a couple steps from his heyday. So for me, I'm really high on Patterson. For redraft leagues, I think him and Allen being about the same rank is probably okay for dynasty leagues. It's no question for me on who's better out of those two.
Oh, so you actually prefer Patterson over Allen in a dynasty format?
I would, yeah, I really would.
That is interesting. The consensus we had for Allen was 8th, and it's 11th for Patterson. So they're very close together. And I mean, I think that tells you a lot considering how much better Allen was last year over the full season's worth of work. Patterson, I think we'd all would agree, has the upside just because of the physical talent that Allen himself doesn't have. But again, that's a little bit interesting to me. Some other interesting points I think we should talk about Patterson here is, North Turner has a little bit of a reputation of going toward the running back in the red zone, and you feel like you probably wouldn't have anyone better to give it to than Adrian Peterson down there. Several of Patterson's touchdowns were on long runs, and we know that those always aren't repeatable. Patterson is a big player at 6'2", 216, but they got some big tight ends on the team. They've got Peterson. Are you worried all about maybe having a low touchdown total, especially given his low average depth of throw last year?
As far as touchdowns, possibly. I sort of view, and I think we can agree, touchdowns are a bit of a fluky stat, only because it ranges very much from year to year. For me, it's all about the fact that they have said repeatedly, hopefully they stick to their word, that they're going to get him the ball and just let him make things happen. So, I'm not so much looking at the touchdowns and the home run balls as the fact that they have made it a point to get him the ball more by any means necessary. So for me, that's my reasoning for picking him over a guy like Allen. Okay.
Well, I think we spent enough time talking about Allen and Patterson, again, 2 top 20 picks in fantasy leagues right now. Guys that, have a ton of talent and could easily return that value, but aren't going to be providing a lot of value for you relative to where their draft picks are, just because you have to pick them so high. Pretty much that is not the case for any other receiver that was a rookie last season. So the rest of these guys, we're talking about players that if they do emerge could end up being major value plays for you in redraft leagues and again in dynasty leagues. Let's start with the guy that may have disappointed more than any other rookie last year, Tavon Austin. Austin was actually the #1 rookie receiver in both the NFL draft last season, taken I think 8th overall by the Rams, and he was actually the #1 receiver in most people's dynasty boards. I think he was for me too. But at 5'8", 174 pounds, there were concerns about his ability to stay on the field. That wasn't really the issue last year as much as that the Rams just didn't seem to want to use him. I'm not sure why that is, but he only had 40 catches for 418 yards and 4 touchdowns. And, Michael, that really seemed to come in about a week or two. What are your thoughts on Austin? He's dropped down to the 38th receiver, 87th overall player in my fantasy league. In a redraft format there. So is Austin a guy that you think maybe can actually show some of his potential this year and get a little bit more opportunities?
No. That's my short answer. I think he, well, and let me ask you something. I think we could probably agree that this year's rookie receiver class, and given I realize there's superstars in Watkins and Evans, is a level above what last year's rookie receiving class was. I would say even remove a Watkins and an Evans. Would you agree that this year's class was probably better than last year's?
I'm not sure the top-end talent is better, but it's way, way deeper.
Okay. So I think a guy like Austin probably, not necessarily a victim, but I think with the lack of receiving depth in last year's draft, that sort of pushed him up a little bit, if that makes sense. That sort of accentuated him and made him a hot commodity simply because there was nothing else out there, personally, what I think happened. So, and then when he got the chance, he had some drops early on, and I think they realized, hey, he needs a little more seasoning than we thought. Because look, like you said, he's 5'8", 174 pounds, and anytime a receiver, especially, anytime I'm bigger than a receiver in the NFL, I'm always a little concerned about how he'll hold up and how he'll produce. The bottom line is he's going to have to be essentially perfect whenever he's on the field. He's going to have to make every catch. He's going to have to make guys miss, and he just didn't do that last year. He had a lot of learning to do. And like you said, most of his production came in that one game, which I think was against was it against the Colts, I think, was where he did most of his damage last year. So, for me, he didn't show as much flash and as much ability last year. And more importantly, I'm not convinced that he's on a good team that will use whatever talent he's got. I mean, he's got an offensive coordinator in Brian Schottenheimer who, look, his days in the Jets, they weren't exactly known for home run balls. They were known as a pound-it team. That's what they do. So I'm expecting a lot more of that this year out of St. Louis. And look, I'm with you. We all thought Austin was going to be a lot better, I think, than he was last year, but he just wasn't. And for me, I just didn't see anything last year that shows me that he's going to make that up this year.
I think you're being a little bit unfair to Austin and sort of the fantasy mentality last year. I think people have come to realize that not every fantasy receiver needs to be Calvin Johnson to be effective. We've seen a lot of slot receivers really emerge and become effective fantasy options in recent seasons. And even though Austin didn't really have a ton of opportunities last year, he did score 0.40 points per opportunity in PPR formats, which was better than Larry Fitzgerald and Victor Cruz, two other very successful slot receivers. So I feel like Austin, he didn't show me anything that makes me think it couldn't ever happen. And I mean, we've seen the Rams too. It seems like it's been forever ago, but Sam Bradford to Danny Amendola was like an amazing slot connection just a couple of seasons ago. And really, it was Amendola's injury problems that prevented that from being a real fantasy option for a long time, more than anything else. So I'm not sure I'm ready to give up on Austin yet, but I agree. There are other players in that range that I'm more willing to take a shot on in a redraft format. I'll mention, too, that in Dynasty, I have him as the 38th receiver, and the consensus in our group has him as the 33rd receiver. So in a sense, we're still buying in. Once you get past the guys that are immediately productive, I think Austin makes a lot of sense. So this may be a pretty good time to try to acquire him in a league, in a Dynasty league, when people are really low on him. It's not like the Rams have added a ton of talent at receiver, unless you think Kenny Britt's found the magic again, Michael.
I do not, for the record. Okay. I do not. But no, you bring up a good point. Look, the one thing I think Austin does have going for him is it's not like they brought in anyone, like you said, to sort of challenge him for snaps and targets. So he's going to get another shot this year. So he'll have every opportunity to make it happen. And I probably agree with you. I mean, now would be, if any time's going to be a buy low time, it's going to be now. Because, look, one of two things is going to happen after this year. Either he's going to blow up and his value's going to skyrocket and you're not going to be able to get him on the cheap, or he's going to have another subpar season and people are pretty much just going to give up on him. So, no, I agree. If there was ever a time to buy low on Tavon Austin, it's probably now.
Speaking about a year from now, I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but if he does tank and the Rams tank, then won't they be bringing in a new quarterback, presumably? I'm not sure that a bad season now would be the death knell of Austin's value. I know that's going to put everyone that owns Austin in another awkward situation in 2015, but I don't think that a terrible season again was going to just erase any fantasy potential he has or erase all the value he would have in a dynasty league. But it certainly would be nice to see him on the field more often in 2014. Okay, next on the docket are actually three players that I've recently written about on PFF Fantasy. So check that article out if you're interested in some sleepers that I like. I guess sleeper is a fair term. We can debate about that a little bit too. But the sort of organization in this article was talking about how I guess a lot of fantasy players are down on these three receivers because of the lack of production they saw in their rookie seasons. And I was just comparing them just in terms of basic statistics and draft round, et cetera, to some other previous rookies that went on to actually be pretty successful, demonstrating that you really shouldn't expect rookie receivers to do much, and the fact that these guys shouldn't be an indication to you that they can't, in fact, have really great sophomore seasons. So let's start, Michael, with my favorite dynasty value right now. That's DeAndre Hopkins of the Texans. He was a round one draft pick last season. I actually think he went a couple of picks before Cordarrelle Patterson in the NFL draft, if memory serves. But a highly touted player out of Clemson, 6'1", 214. He wasn't terrible last year. He had 53 catches for 802 yards, but only had 2 touchdowns, which dropped him down to the 48th ranked wide receiver in fantasy. And the fact that he tailed off toward the end of the season, I think, soured people on him as a prospect. You can see that in redraft leagues, in my fantasy league, his ADP is the 34th receiver and the overall 76th player. What do you think about all of this, Michael? Is Hopkins a guy that you think can maybe turn it around from his bad end of last season? And sort of, what do you see as his connection to Andre Johnson? I know there's been a lot of buzz this offseason about, him being unhappy with the Texans. They've got a new quarterback. There's a lot of change potentially going on down there. What do you think of Hopkins?
No, I'm right there with you, Scott. I love the guy. I mean, like you said, he had 50 catches for 800 yards. And let's not forget, that was with Matt Schaub and Case Keenum throwing him the ball, with Andre Johnson on the opposite side. I mean, that's those numbers are pretty impressive when you think about it in the circumstance he was in.
Mhm.
And I remember last year with rookie drafts, he was more often than not the second guy taken off the board. No, I'm a big fan of his. I think, they did bring in Ryan Fitzpatrick this year in Houston, who, he's not going to be a couple levels above a Schaub or a Keenum, but I think he'll be a tad better. And look, I'm one of those that I think he could benefit from Andre Johnson sticking around. Obviously he'd be the top target there if he were to leave, but look, I don't think it can hurt to have one of the greatest receivers of all time opposite side of you for another season. So, no, I'm right there with you. I think he's a great value. I think he's still going to be very, very good. And I think, the Texans overall are really, really close to being, an elite team, especially in offense. So, yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I mean, if he was if he's going 34th as a receiver, in a normal 12-team league, you're looking at, your third receiver being DeAndre Hopkins in redraft or dynasty leagues, and I think that's probably pretty good.
So let's talk a little bit about team building strategy and fantasy drafts real quick, Michael, because I feel like that has a lot to do with whether or not you're going to want to take a shot on Hopkins in your team. I found that in a lot of cases, if I have an early pick in the first round and end up with a running back, when I circle back toward the end of the second round, we may be coming up on the end of the major running backs with a lot of potential. In fact, Hopkins' teammate Arian Foster is a player that you may find toward the end of the second round that I like a lot as an option there. But once you get outside the top 15 or so at running backs, things can get really dicey. So if you like to go running back heavy early, you may end up with a team with say an Antonio Brown as your number one receiver, and then you may be feeling like, okay, my chances at receiver aren't looking as good against teams that might have a Dez Bryant as their number one and then a decent number two like a Jordy Nelson. Somebody like that would have a huge advantage over you. For me, if I'm building my team that way, that's the perfect team to take a guy like DeAndre Hopkins and several other major upside receiving plays. Because especially in shallower formats, you're going to be able to pick up guys that emerge early in the season to fill in sort of your wide receiver 3 and 4 holes if you end up having those. So to me, you really want players that have some major upside. And to me, Hopkins fits that bill. I'd like to point out, too, that he had a 1.89% drop rate last year, which was second only behind Larry Fitzgerald. So I love that combination of size and hands that Hopkins offers. So, again, this is my favorite value right now in Dynasty. So I definitely encourage everyone to draft Hopkins as early as the sixth round. I know he's going as an 8th round pick, but my feeling is that probably will increase going forward.
Well, everyone can do that, Scott, except the people in our leagues, is what you're going to say. So.
Yeah, probably fair. I will mention, too, that in Dynasty, I have Hopkins as my 18th ranked receiver, and the consensus among the PFF fantasy guys is 20th. So I'm definitely not out on a limb here either. They might not see him emerging quite as soon as me this season, but I think a lot of the PFF fantasy guys still buy into Hopkins as a major talent. Okay, the next two guys, again, these are guys from my article, and not going necessarily in the same order here, but some other interesting players. One is Justin Hunter of the Titans, who was an early round 2 draft pick last season, but again didn't make much of an impact in fantasy last season. He had just 18 catches for 354 yards and 4 touchdowns, so barely in the top 100 among receivers last season. But I think some people are starting to recognize that things may be changing in Tennessee this season. He's going off as the 45th receiver in standard redraft leagues or in PPR. Or I guess it's a combination. He's going off as 45th receiver in redraft leagues. Overall, 106th. So in terms of Tennessee, what do you think about their offense this season? Last year, Hunter only got about his third as many snaps as Nate Washington. Do you think that has a chance to maybe flip-flop this season? Could Hunter be the starting primary outside receiver?
I think so. I mean, look, they drafted him in the second round for a reason, which is a pretty high investment in a guy. So, and look, he's had a very good offseason by all accounts. So, yeah, I think he could probably get that chance. I still don't like the the Titans offense just as a whole. I mean, they did bring in Ken Whisenhunt as coach, who, like we said before, did wonders in San Diego last year. But to me, it just comes down to Jake Locker and what your feelings on him are. If you think he can be an average quarterback, then hey, I think Hunter can probably be pretty good. But if you think he's going to tank it this year, then I think watch out. Now, as the 45th overall receiver, I mean, you're looking at, what is that? Is that your fourth receiver or third receiver in 12-team leagues? I think that's fourth.
I think it's on the third, fourth boundary, right?
Yeah, I mean, which to me, I mean, if he's your third, I think that might be pushing it. If he's your fourth, though, I would love that guy as my fourth receiver, especially in redraft leagues. I'm guessing his value is a lot higher in dynasty leagues, which I would probably tend to agree with.
It's not dramatically higher, at least among our rankers. I have Hunter as the 39th receiver in dynasty, and the consensus is the 37th. I think people recognize that the Titans may not be world beaters anytime soon, especially because, I mean, the problem with Locker is more about his inability to stay healthy than it is anything else. But
well, and for me, the positive in that situation is, look, I can't believe Ken Wisenhunt is going to roll with Jake Locker forever. I mean, no one is predicting Tennessee to do any good this year, quite honestly, which most likely means Wisenhunt's going to bring in his own guy next year. I mean, unless, of course, you think Zach Mettenberger is the answer, which probably not. So, I think if they brought in a quarterback next year, especially a highly rated one from the draft possibly, that's going to make Hunter's value do a 180 and go right back up again.
Yeah, the reason I think I really like Hunter, especially as a redraft player this season, is I feel like there's uncertainty in sort of the community whether or not Hunter can be a starter right now. Last year, like I said, he played only about his third as many snaps as Nate Washington. But Washington, when the quarterbacks on Tennessee threw him the ball, they had a 58.2 quarterback rating, which was 87th of 94 qualified throwers. It's kind of Jimmy Clausen territory, Michael, as I think you might notice.
No one wants to be there, Scott.
No, not at all. And it's also, I think, important to mention that Hunter had 4 touchdowns in that limited work last year, and is 6'4". He might make a really valuable red zone target that could complement Kendall Wright in the interior, a guy that has just 6 touchdowns in a 2-year career and doesn't really seem to be a major part of the red zone offense there. So I don't think it would stun me if Hunter ended up A, starting, and B, catching like 8 to 10 touchdowns, even if he had sort of a limited number of total catches this season, if that makes sense to you, Michael. Yeah. So I feel like he's a player that will eventually become the starter this season, and that's going to make him gain in value whether or not he ends up having a successful season or not. So he's a guy that I'm targeting in drafts in the time being to sort of just see that sort of play out. And then maybe if you want, you can trade him a little down the line, and it'll return you a nice little return there.
Yeah, I think of the guys we're talking about tonight, he's probably the ultimate boomer bust pick. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think he's of all these guys, he would be the one that wouldn't surprise me if he was basically useless in fantasy this season. Right. Whereas a guy like Hopkins, I have a hard time believing he's not going to finish in the top 40, even though that's not going to really help you in fantasy.
Sure.
I mean, that's sort of his baseline, whereas Hunter, who knows?
Right. Well, and yeah, like you said, with Hopkins, look, that 5,800 line, I'm viewing that as his floor now. I mean, if someone can do that their rookie year with Case Keenum and Matt Schaub as quarterback throwing you the ball, I think you can do a lot better than that.
Yeah. So when I was looking up for the article that I wrote, looking for comparable players that had seasons similar to Hunter as a rookie, there was a couple guys like Emmanuel Sanders, guys that eventually have become solid receivers but didn't do so as a second-year player. And then there were a lot of busts, guys that you barely can even remember. But then there was also Alshon Jeffrey. So, I mean, it's certainly not unprecedented that a player would go from having that little production as a rookie to then being a very viable player. And to me, Hunter is one of the more talented receivers in the game, physically speaking. So, why not take a gamble on him later in your draft? It's a bench spot anyway. It's a guy with major upside.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Let's see. Well, we've already spent a lot of time on the show, but there's one more player that I want to get to here for today. And then, Michael, I think we're going to have to push. We have at least 6 more guys after this to hit. So I think we're going to be doing this again next week with some lower down guys too. But the next guy is a guy that really surprised many players last season by having a fairly successful rookie season. But I think maybe his lack of prospect pedigree plus his team situation might have something to do with his lesser draft status right now. But that player is Terrence Williams of the Cowboys. Again, Williams was a round 3 pick. He went right around where Keenan Allen did, but there wasn't the injury concern to drive down his value last season. But he had a great rookie year with 44 catches, 736 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Was the 45th receiver overall in PPR formats. So, I mean, for a guy with a round 3 draft status, I think that's a pretty solid season. He's currently going as the 35th receiver in my Fantasy League ADP, the 79th overall player. So kind of similar to where DeAndre Hopkins is going, just a little bit behind him. I've got a myriad of stats here to talk about here with Williams, but let's start there with how do you think the fact that he's on the Cowboys and opposite a player like Dez Bryant, a clear top 5 player at the position, how does that impact Williams' ability to maybe become a top 20 or top 10 receiver in your mind?
I don't know that he'll ever get to top 10 status, but I think he's definitely capable of top 20 for sure. And look, you could probably argue that he's been the best second receiver in that offense that they've had in a long, long time. I mean, look, they've trolled out, Miles Austin and Laurent Robinson and a bunch of other guys who, quite frankly, didn't last very long. And I think, at least with Terrence Williams, he's got a chance to stick around. And yeah, I looked up his stats earlier, and I quite honestly was surprised at the line he had. I didn't realize he had that many receiving yards last year. And look, obviously it's a very pass-heavy offense. I mean, Dallas passed the 4th most times last year in the entire NFL, so they're going to throw it. They brought in Scott Linehan from Detroit, which means they're going to throw it probably even more. Like DeAndre Hopkins, I don't think it hurts his value a whole heck of a lot to have a guy like Dez Bryant or Andre Johnson opposite you. I don't know that Terrence Williams could be the number 1 guy on a team if you took him off of Dallas. So I think being in a situation like he is with the Cowboys where he's, the clear-cut second banana, but which means he's going to see a lot of single coverage, I think that's ideal for him. And I think he's very, very capable of a top 20 finish.
I think so too. So Williams last year, he caught all 9 of his catchable deep balls for 327 yards and 3 touchdowns. I think it might surprise people to realize that he's got some explosive ability. He reminds me a little bit of Mike Wallace in his Pittsburgh days, both in terms of sort of status coming into his second year and the team situation here. Remember, Wallace used to be behind a couple of guys in Plexico Burress and Hines Ward, and then his second year, I think that's when I don't which one of the two left. I guess Burress must have left to go to the Giants at that point. Yep. And so to me, you're sort of seeing that here where all of a sudden Williams finds himself clearly the number 2 guy with Miles Austin gone in Cleveland, and I think he can have a really strong year this year. So that's why I think that he's being a little bit undervalued too. And then in Dynasty, it's clearly the case that I'm higher on him than the consensus. I have him as the 30th rated wide receiver, and the consensus is 39th. So that's a bit of a jump there. But I think it's time to sort of forget about the fact that he wasn't a higher draft pick and say that, wow, he really impressed as a rookie. So I think it's time to believe. And you mentioned how bad the Cowboys could be this year. I mean, their defense is atrocious. So they're going to be throwing the ball quite a lot. So I feel like
it's going to be good times there, believe me. For any offensive player, it's going to be. Believe me, I am buying the entire Dallas offense.
Yeah, he could have quite a few catches this season, even with some other guys on the team like Brian around there.
Well, and look, the one thing they're looking, I think, for in that position, meaning Dallas, is just stability. I mean, they haven't had anyone to stick there that's been around for more than a season or two in a very long time. I mean, you might have to go back to the Alvin Harper days to have a decent guy as your second receiver there. So, hopefully Williams can stay healthy, and hopefully he can stay on the track he's on now.
Yep, so that was a good list of some of the potential second-year receivers that can really help fantasy owners this year. We mentioned before, though, there's several more guys that we want to touch on, so I think Michael and I are going to return to that next week. So thanks everybody for listening into this episode of the Fantasy Slant. Keep in mind that the PFF Fantasy Gold product is going live this week, so definitely subscribe to that. I think it's well worth the price if you want to read some of Michael and my good content and all the other great writers at PFF Fantasy over the course of the rest of the offseason and the NFL season. And then we'll return next week for another episode of the Fantasy Slant. So thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.